welcome to the Big Seance Podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
Hey, Paranerds. So, I was just sitting here thinking and planning for a speaking engagement at the local library that's coming up soon. And we've called it Haunted Stories at the Library. So I'm thinking back to some of my early experiments and investigations, and I looked through some of those early episodes of the podcast, and I was reminded that I recorded a shorter episode about Pearl Curran, who channeled works from a spirit or entity named Patience Worth. This episode from 2015, episode 32, was actually just me reading two articles that I found. And at that time, I was also making my way through a book on the topic. So after revisiting that and sitting here thinking, I kind of want to dig into this again. And I'm thinking about covering Pearl and Patience in my talk at the library. I wanted to share the articles from that old episode with you today, but first, there's a better and more delicious article that I wish I would have read in that episode in 2015, and so I want to read that now. Understand that it's a massive article, so I've selected portions from it to read today. So you might want to check the whole thing out. It's from a September 2010 article from Smithsonian magazine by Gioia Diliberto, and I'll link to it in the show notes at BigSeance.com. Actually, you might be sad if I don't pour the tea today, so I'll do that first. Here we go. One cool autumn evening in 1919, a crowd of prominent New Yorkers jammed the parlor of an East Side townhouse to meet a writing prodigy named Patience Worth, a prolific charmer who was known for her flashy verbal stunts and quick wit. Patience dictated two original poems about Russia and the Red Cross in rapid succession, followed by a lyrical tribute to an editor friend. Though she seemed to compose the works on the spot, her words flowed with the quality of messages punched out by teletype. Poet Edgar Lee Masters was among the astonished guests. There is no doubt she is producing remarkable literature, the author of Spoon River Anthology told a reporter, though how she does it, I cannot say. Nor could he say how Patience looked, though she was thought to be young and pretty, with wavy red hair and large brown eyes. No one, however, actually saw her. She wasn't real. She was an ambitious, hard-working spirit. Speaking through a Ouija board, operated by Pearl Lenore Curran, a St. Louis housewife of limited education, Patience Worth was nothing short of a national phenomenon in the early years of the 20th century. Though her works are virtually forgotten today, the prestigious Braithwaite anthology listed 5 of her poems among the nation's best published in 1917, and the New York Times hailed her first novel as a feat of literary composition. Her output was stunning. In addition to 7 books, she produced voluminous poetry, short stories, plays, and reams of sparkling conversation, nearly 4 million words between 1913 and 1937. Some evenings, she worked on a novel, a poem, and a play simultaneously, alternating her dictation from one to another without missing a beat. What is extraordinary about this case is the fluidity, versatility, virtuosity, and literary quality of Patience' writings, which are unprecedented in the history of automatic writing by mediums, says Stephen Broad, a professor of philosophy at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and a past president of the American Parapsychological Association, who has written widely on paranormal phenomena. Almost overnight, Patience transformed Pearl Curran from a restless homemaker plagued by nervous ailments into a busy celebrity who traveled the country giving performances starring Patience. Night after night, Pearl, a tall, blue-eyed woman in a fashionable dress, would sit with her Ouija board while her husband, John, recorded Patience' utterances in shorthand. Those who witnessed the performances, some of them leading scholars, feminists, politicians, and writers, believed they'd seen a miracle. I still confess myself completely baffled by the experience, Otto Heller, dean of the Graduate School of Washington University in St. Louis, recalled years later. Through Pearl, Patience claimed to be an unmarried Englishwoman who had emigrated to Nantucket Island in the late 1600s and been killed in an Indian raid. For 3 centuries, she said, she'd searched for an earthly cranny, as in cranium, to help her fulfill a burning literary ambition. She'd found it at last in Pearl. A long list of psychical sleuths, psychologists, and other skeptics tried to debunk Patience and prove that Pearl was a fraud. No one succeeded. Scholars who examined Patience's work marveled at her deep knowledge of the plants, customs, clothing, and cuisine of several historical epochs, stretching back to the ancients, and at her ability to draw on this vast knowledge without hesitation. Maybe there was some preparation going on during the day, yet that alone cannot account for the material Pearl was producing, says Daniel Shea, professor emeritus of English at Washington University, who has studied the case and believes it can be explained without citing supernatural forces. The Patience Worth case remains one of the most tantalizing literary mysteries of the last century, a window onto a vanished era when magic seemed to exist because so many people believed in it. In the decades since Pearl Curran's death in 1937, no one has explained how she produced Patience writing. Combing through the voluminous archives, however, a modern sensibility starts to see clues and patterns that may not have been apparent at a time when science was just starting to explore the far reaches of the human mind. So alive was Patience's language that many of those who sat with Pearl at the Ouija board felt they could see the gestures and facial expressions accompanying her words. Patience Worth is arch and coquettish, with a mind of no small power and altogether lovable, wrote William Marion Reedy, editor of The Mirror, one of the nation's leading journals of opinion and literary criticism. The overweight editor started out a skeptic, but quickly fell in thrall to this glib, hyperliterate personality, who affectionately called him Fatawide. He had learned to love her as a person, more real than many whose hands I grasp, he confessed in The Mirror. Before Patience, Pearl Curran's life had the feel of a tightly laced corset, one that over the years had narrowed and grown more constrained. Born in Mound City, Illinois in 1883, She was the only child of George Pollard, an itinerant railroad employee and newspaperman, and his high-strung, ambitious wife, Mary. The Pollards moved a great deal, from Illinois to southern Missouri to Texas, as Pollard sought better-paying jobs. Pearl's mother was extremely distressed by her husband's inability to provide a stable living, and after she had a nervous breakdown when Pearl was 4, sent her daughter to live for a while with the child's grandmother in St. Louis. This article then talks about how Pearl had a troubled childhood, and she wasn't a very good student and actually dropped out at 13. At 24, she married John Curran, a widowed immigration official and sometimes businessman, 12 years her senior. In 1908, the newlyweds moved to St. Louis, which was pulsing with prosperity. The nation's top producer of beer and a manufacturing center for leather goods, St. Louis boasted 4 daily newspapers, sumptuous mansions, and beautiful parks. In the fall of 1912, soon after Pearl's father died, Emily, who was a friend of Pearl, suggested that she and Pearl try to contact him through Emily's Ouija board. Twice a week, while their husbands played pinochle in the next room, Emily and Pearl sat facing each other on stiff-backed chairs in Pearl's parlor, the board balanced on their knees and their fingers placed lightly on the heart-shaped planchette. Guided supposedly by supranormal forces, the pointer spelled out messages by alighting on the letters of the alphabet printed on the board. Though occasionally the board spelled out intelligible words, usually family names, it gave up mostly gibberish. To Pearl, it was all silly chatter, a kind of fortune-teller's babble, she recalled in a 1915 interview with the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. Then, on the evening of July 8, 1913, no sooner had Emily and Pearl placed their fingers on the pointer than it raced to the letters M, A, N, and Y. Within minutes, the women had this message: "Many moons ago I lived. Again I come. Patience Worth, my name." Emily was immediately convinced that they'd made contact with the spirit and took control of questioning Patience. Emily: "Where was your home?" Patience: "Across the sea." Emily: "In what city or country?" Patience: "About me ye would know much. Yesterday is dead. Let thy mind rest as to the past." Over the next weeks, it became clear to Pearl that she, not Hutchings, who was Emily, her friend, was the spirit's medium. She said she was astounded by the pictures and words that played through her mind like a movie as soon as she sat at the Ouija board. Pearl described this realization as when the bolt fell. News of the phenomenon traveled quickly through the Currans' middle-class neighborhood, and they were deluged with requests to witness Pearl communing with Patience. In no time, large groups of people were gathering regularly in the Currans' home. These evenings had the atmosphere of church suppers, with a buffet on the dining table, children running about, and a few men smelling up the parlor with cigars. There were no dimmed lights, burning candles, chanting, or any other trappings of the occult. One by one, visitors would be called to sit with Pearl, who would let them question Patience or request a poem on a specific topic. Sometimes, when Patience used a particularly odd word, John Curran would interrupt his note-taking to look it up in an encyclopedia. Invariably, an impulse to write would seize Patience, and she would announce that it was time to work on one of her novels or plays. Then the pointer would fly around the board, and Pearl would call out words at the rate of 1,500 or so an hour, with never a second's hesitation and never an alteration, noted a social worker who attended a Patience Worth evening in 1918. At first, Pearl spelled out every letter with the Ouija board, but as time passed, the mere touch of her hand on the pointer loosed a flood of spoken words. Eventually, she abandoned the board entirely. A feeling of slight pressure in her head would announce Patience's arrival, and Pearl would begin reciting. While Pearl recited, she behaved normally, with her eyes open and her senses alert to the faces and noises around her. This is a quote. Sometimes she looks over to a guest while writing and asks some question entirely foreign to what she is spelling out, again answers the telephone or inquires what the message was, exchanges a few words of greeting to late visitors as they enter, and goes on with the work without a moment's hesitation, recalled a visitor. Occasionally, she'd even smoke a cigarette. But who was Patience? A fraud? A spirit? The product of Pearl Curran's subconscious mind? By the 1920s, the fame of Patience and Pearl had begun to dim. The literary landscape was being reshaped by the likes of Hemingway and James Joyce, and the flapper was the new feminine ideal. Patience came to seem a throwback to an outworn era of table rappings and seances, of sentimentalism and blind faith in God. Again, that was from the September 2010 article from Smithsonian magazine by Gioia Diliberto. Y'all, I cannot tell you just how much I'd love to hop in a time machine and get myself invited to one of those bi-weekly Ouija sessions, or what they called Patience Worth sessions. And I would be skeptical as hell, but it would still be delicious. And since it's here in St. Louis, even though it mentions that she was living in a middle-class neighborhood, I think about how Pearl started her channeling on the Ouija board not long after the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904, and so those images from Meet Me in St. Louis pop in my head. I think about Forest Park and the Muni, two of my favorite places, and she almost certainly would have spent some time there, being in St. Louis. I'd love to know where exactly her home was and what it looked like. Knowing St. Louis, though, I think we can be pretty confident that it's no longer there, unfortunately. There's also a book out there which I've read, and it's called The Patience of Pearl, Spiritualism and Authorship in the Writings of Pearl Curran by Daniel B. Shea. And it was actually just mentioned in this article. Just know it's written in a very academic way and probably from a more skeptical point of view as well, if I'm remembering correctly. And so this brings me to the two other articles that I read in episode 32 in 2015. I sound quite a bit younger, and I hadn't really settled into a comfortable podcast voice yet, so it's kind of hard for me to listen to. But here we go. And I'll see you on the other side.
Hauntings with Ginger Collins Justice from December 11th, 2014. One of the stories we hit on was the story of Pearl Curran and Patience Worth. And I can't help thinking about Patience every time I talk to one of our favorite guests, Karen A. Dahlman, about her work with the Ouija. If you're just learning about Patience Worth, let me introduce you to the story, and then you'll see why it captivates me. Here's a portion of an article titled Ghostwriter and Ghost, The Strange Case of Pearl Curran and Patience Worth, written by Ed Simon. Many moons ago I lived, again I come. Patience Worth my name. Wait, I would speak with thee. If thou shalt live, then shall I. Good friends, let us be merry. On July 8th, 1913, After months of experimentation, a St. Louis housewife named Pearl Curran finally had a breakthrough with her Ouija board. From this initial correspondence, Pearl Curran wrote, or depending on your perspective, transcribed, millions of words she attributed to a 17th century poet who called herself Patience Worth. Historical novels, religious tracts, and lyric poems were published and embraced by mainstream scholars as authentic examples of early American literature mediated from beyond the grave. The figure of Patience Worth was commended as an exemplary writer by organizations such as the Joint Committee of Literary Arts of New York. She was included in journals alongside such future canonical authors as Edna St. Vincent Millay, and she appeared in collections such as the Anthology of Magazine Writing and the Yearbook of American Poetry. All the more amazingly, readers and critics agreed that this was new work by a woman who claimed to have been dead for more than 2.5 centuries. These writings were either authentic documents that provided astounding evidence of humanity's survival after death, or an intricate and impressive hoax that hoodwinked scholars, critics, and editors. There is also another possibility that these works were the improvisational literary productions of a prodigy who believed herself to be a conduit of some muse from the hereafter. Questions of authorship and intention aside, what remains are the books, plays, and poems, once popular literature and now forgotten. Curran's output prompts us to ask some fundamental questions about history, genre, intention, effect, authorship, and why we choose to read what we read. Furthermore, her writings are a fascinating curio of an era in American literary history when academics and quacks, the rational and the occult, scholarship and magic all mingled together in popular discourse. Pearl Curran was born in 1883, towards the end of a century that saw the national landscape and the United States' position in the world radically altered. She and her audience were inheritors of the sometimes bizarre religious diversity of the American 19th century. It was a century that began with the religious anarchism of the Second Great Awakening, was defined by an apocalyptic civil war, and which moved into the bourgeois and respectable spiritualism of the late Victorian era. Occult experimentation was embraced by leading thinkers and writers, like William James, who with other leading scientists founded the American Society for Psychical Research. Curran was enmeshed in a culture of esoterica that she would have encountered during a Victorian adolescence. And the figure of Patience Worth revealed herself at a perfect time, just as the rising international power that was the United States began to critically reevaluate its 17th century Puritan origins. Colonial American writings were long dismissed as embarrassing anti-intellectual relics by great 19th century authors like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Nathaniel Hawthorne. In the early years of the 20th century, however, scholars began re-evaluating the 17th century canon. Pearl Curran supplied a perfect model in her creation of Patience Worth, who was included alongside actual poets as an example of colonial American artistic genius. As the United States began to assert itself on a global stage, it looked back towards its then agreed upon New England origins and began to refine its creation myth, extolling the virtues of Puritan thrift, industriousness, and individuality. Importantly for Curran, the colonial period was also one where women's voices were surprisingly not ignored. In early American poetry, the 17th century poet Anne Bradstreet born 1612, died 1672, dominates as the single most exemplary and important literary figure. Other women writers like Mary Rowlandson, born 1637, died 1711, were the Puritan equivalents of bestsellers. This newfound enthusiasm for colonial American letters arrived at a perfect time for Curran. Indeed, the relative respect that colonial women writers like Bradstreet received dovetailed well with the feminine realm that was the early 20th century seance. As Gioia Diliberto makes clear in her excellent introduction to the Patience Worth phenomena, Patience Worth, author from the great beyond, soon scores of self-anointed mediums burst on the scene, most of them women, whose passivity and purity, it was believed, made them ideal vessels to receive news from the other side. It's possible to view Curran as a native literary genius who, unable to promote her own authentic voice, is forced to invent a fictional persona that operates as her literary mask. Indeed, this is often how the case of Patience Worth is read. It's not without precedent. From the Fox sisters of upstate New York to Madame Blavatsky, the seance has often been a woman's game, able to supply a distinctly feminine voice when the larger society would not otherwise listen. It is certainly possible to see Patience Worth in these terms, but it's limiting to exclude other possible interpretations of this strange corpus. Curran cannot be seen as just another literary-minded medium. Her case was different. Mediums like Blavatsky strongly delineated between their own writings and the short passages attributed to spirits. Curran, however, produced an incredible number of writings, all of which were attributed to Patience Worth. There are scores of poems, letters, and novels, including Telka, The Sorry Tale, Hope Trueblood, The Pot Upon the Wheel, Samuel Wheaton, and Elizabethan Mask, among other works. How should one consider the sheer amount and breadth of such works? If a hoax, it is still a hoax that is anything but simple or easy. Although we do not need to explain such a prolific career framed in such a bizarre manner by suggesting that Patience Worth was a real person, there exists the possibility that Curran understood authorship in a more unconventional way than the wider culture frequently does. Between the possibilities of Patience Worth's reality and Pearl Curran's duplicity, there exists a third option, that Pearl Curran transcribed these works believing Patience Worth to be real, a creation of her own mind communicating these words back to her, an internal muse, if you will, whose existence serves to reevaluate the simple individual models of authorship we conventionally hold to. As such, her corpus provides an occasion for thinking about where inspiration comes from, how authors generate their writings, and the ways in which something as seemingly well understood as writing still contains a kernel of mystery at its core. Outside of occult circles, the embarrassing metaphysical nature of Patience Worth has relegated her to complete obscurity in the academic world for a century. There is not much respectability in the academic study of something that seems to be a hoax. This is an unfair fate for writings that, though not as technically proficient as works deemed canonical, still deserve study and attention, not just because of the way they illuminate an unusual period of American literary history, but also because the writings themselves are arguably more aesthetically proficient than one might expect. The critics who extolled the quality of Worth/Curran had their reasons for doing so, some of which still hold up. It should be emphasized again that these are not just short lyric poems that one could see a Ouija-using author writing in a few minutes. The sheer length of some of her books is astounding in itself, to say nothing of their literary quality. One need only flip through The Pot Upon the Wheel, a verse play whose dialogue sometimes reminds one of the spiritual urgency of a classical religious text like the Bhagavad Gita. Or take A Sorry Tale, a more than 600-page esoteric account of the life of Christ that at points reaches a prophetic pitch, calling to mind the theology of William Blake. Thankfully, this critical blind spot is beginning to be rectified with scholarly books like Daniel Shea's The Patience of Pearl, Spiritualism and Authorship in the Writings of Pearl Curran, published in 2012, and the aforementioned Diliberto article in 2010. They provide an excellent overview on the particulars of the Patience-Worth case, analyzing not just biography, but also the context that produced these writings, and their reception and their loss. When dipping into the voluminous corpus of writings, one of the first things you notice is that they don't bear the haphazard stream of consciousness style so common in the automatic writing practiced by Dadaist poets and other avant-garde groups. But they also don't read like 17th century American prose and poetry, despite what early critical advocates of Pearl Curran like Caspar Yost may have claimed. At most, one could say that the works exhibit qualities of pastiche in their depiction of how American Puritans wrote and talked, though none of this should diminish the very real personality that seems to come through communications of Patience-Worth. She appears as variously smart, pious, sentimental, feisty, and sarcastic. She doesn't read as a mere echo of Curran herself. As artistic creation, the idea of Patience-Worth rather than her words are what is central. In reading her verse, one encounters a persona that, while three-dimensionally vibrant, doesn't seem to match our expectations of how a 17th century New England woman would write. While syntax and phrasing can seem largely authentic, there is little of the orthodox Calvinism one finds in actual early American poets like Bradstreet, Edward Taylor, or Michael Wigglesworth. Rather, she seems to offer a broadly spiritual, New Age philosophy in keeping with the circumstances of her discovery. Later in this article, the author writes, "The Patience-Worth case complicates questions of authorship. While it seems clear that Curran is the literal author, the fictionality surrounding the very productions of authorship helps to complicate our conceptions of creation and interpretation. Since the French philosopher Roland Barthes' 1967 essay, The Death of the Author, both formalists and historicists have become increasingly comfortable with the idea that authorship itself is a sort of fiction. Patience-Worth / Pearl Curran makes this fictionality all the more obvious. As such, it seems that she is more than overdue for a critical rediscovery. In the long view of cultural history, her place becomes even more interesting. Biography and history become compressed, and the relationship between who is a real person and who is a fictional person becomes more ontologically uncertain. I'm going to break any sort of pose of objectivity and say emphatically that I do not believe that Patience-Worth was anything more than a full-bodied creation of Pearl Curran." And this again is the author from the article. It's worth pointing out that there are no records of any actual Patience-Worth having lived either in New England or Dorsetshire, where Curran claimed the poet was born. Yet, imagine someone reading Curran a millennium from now. Would such distinctions as whether Worth is real or not matter to this imagined reader? For classicists, there are arguments about the reality of an author named Homer, ones that scholars working on much later periods don't have to consider in the same way. Philosophically, if a heteronym's words seem as full and real as an actual person? Why can't they be treated as such? The fullness of the fictionality of Patience Worth is that it is a fictionality which imposes itself on the real world, and that in itself is a fascinating act of literary creation. This article by Ed Simon can be found at publicdomainreview.org, a project of the Open Knowledge Foundation. A 2013 article from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, written by Jane Henderson and shared by permission, fills us in on a strange twist to this story in a section of the article titled Two Moms and a Baby. For 21st century readers who are interested in neither the paranormal nor Worth's poetry, the Patience/Pearl story has yet another outrageous element. In 1916, Patience Worth decided that Pearl and John Curran should adopt a baby and that she, the spirit, would be its godmother. She urged the Currans to find a baby in need, and the story went that a poor, pregnant widow agreed to give up her infant. One gossip, however, later claimed that John Curran's daughter, 16, gave birth in secret. Known as the Ouija board baby and Patience Wee, a photo of the lass in a Puritan bonnet and ruby cross was published in 1917. Patience had ordered that the baby be spinster prim, though Shea says no Puritan would have worn a cross, let alone a ruby one. A St. Louis newspaper reported in 1917 that Patience Wee was given many presents, including a shawl from the Orient and a French war orphan, whose care was paid for 2 years in Patience Wee's name. The story noted that Patience Worth wrote verses for the tot, and no real flesh and blood mother could express more devoted sentiments. Yet another curious addition to the family appeared 6 months after John Curran died in 1922. After years of childlessness, and with Curran on his deathbed, Pearl conceived at age 39. Shea, through close reading of the Patience Worth records, indicates that the real father of the baby, Eileen, may have been a prominent lawyer, John Cashman. Sisters Patience Wee and young Eileen would end up moving to California with Pearl, who would marry twice more. Their lives didn't necessarily calm down. While Curran's fame had diminished, she still talked to her spirit for the likes of Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. Eventually, Eileen became a caretaker for Patience Wee, now called Patty, and Patty's husband. Both apparently were alcoholics, and Patty was found dead at age 27 after drinking and taking sleeping pills. Curran died in 1937 at age 54. Obituaries said she never became wealthy, despite Patience Worth's fame. She was not the best or last poet to channel spirits. Others included William Butler Yeats, Sylvia Plath, and James Merrill. But unlike those respected poets, the Patience/Pearl case is unique in that the invisible spirit, rather than the earthly writer, remains the literary star.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. And you can continue the discussion and hang out with a great community of Paranerds by joining us in the Big Seance Parlor on Facebook. Want to hear your voice in a future episode? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time. Thank you to the following super Paranerds who support this show at patreon.com/Big Seance. Jennifer Scanlon, Michael Henson, Daryl, Anne Marie Sullivan, Natalie N., Kim Robb, Joe C.L. Lorenzo, Susan Davey, and Sue. And by the way, Sue is fabulous. And I want you to know that she has been left off this list for quite a while now, just because I have been really not great at being able to figure out the different levels and the lists in Patreon, which is kind of confusing, and I've been screwing that up. But, she's on the list now. So thank you, Sue. You rock. My supporters at the Parlor guest level, who can be found at bigseance.com/Parlor guests, are Anne Rekovich of OzParatech.com, Dina DeCastro of Dina DeCastro Astrology, Janae Michaels from Grey House Tarot and Farm Artifacts, Amy Park Gedicke of amyparkg.com, Lonnie Scott from weirdwebradio.com, Lana and John of Carbon Lilies, Midge Munster from midgemunster.com, Heather N. of dancingbeealchemy.com, Diane Razmataz, Tracy King, Andrew Watson, Amy Taylor, Christine Rath-Selhe, Mindy Kintop, Hope Battaglia, Cass and Bailey, Melissa Armour, Janet Shaw-Binns, Bruce Williams, and Christopher Kohler. And I currently have 5 fabulous listeners who support this show at the $10 level, which isn't even a thing. Which, by the way, there are several people in this group who were left out last week because, again, I keep screwing up my Patreon list, so I apologize, and I love y'all so much. So basically, the group that I'm reading today goes the same for last week. But anyway, these $10 Paranerds are Glenna Becker, Peggy Hagan, Steve, and the lovely Judy Skinner, and James Wilfong. I also have 3 wonderful listeners who support the show at the completely made-up $20 level. And those peeps are Norman and Linda Keller and Kevin Gilbert. Thank you, Paranerds.